Hello, my name is Ryan Simons, and today I'm going to be talking about religious violence from Reverend Michael Bray and the Army of God. Before I begin, I want to note that this presentation will focus primarily on Reverend Michael Bray rather than the Army of God as a whole. However, it is important to understand that Bray's motives and justifications align very closely with the beliefs and actions of the Army of God. My first slide talks about who they are, starting with the Army of God, which is a Christian extremist group that advocates for anti-abortion violence in the United States. Reverend Michael Bray is a key vocal supporter of this movement, defending the killing of abortion providers, deeming it a form of defensive Christian action rather than murder. He openly supports individuals who commit violence to prevent abortions and sees such acts as morally justified by biblical standards. I first learned about Reverend Michael Bray during our class lecture titled Christian Religious Terrorism, as well as through our discussion on the Michael Bray interview with Richard Dawkins, where he discussed his view on the murder of Dr. Bray. What drew me in was how someone could use Christian scripture and theology to defend violence so confidently, especially in a public and unapologetic way. It made me really curious to understand more about Bray's beliefs, motivations, and his overall understanding of the Bible. Going into the background summary, Michael Bray was involved in bombing abortion clinics in 1985. He served 4 years in prison because of this, but it is important to note that he strategically did the bombings when the clinics were empty, claiming that his goal wasn't just to kill, but it wasn't to kill, it was to stop abortions from being performed. The Army of God is linked to a wider pattern of violence, including arsons, anthrax hoax letters, and clinical bombings. The group has connected ideology with lone wolf attackers like Paul Hill, who murdered abortion provider Dr. John Britton. Referring to this case, Reverend Michael Bray defended Hill's actions by referencing the Old Testament, where it states that the law of citizens is to protect and defend each other. He was also cited in the previously mentioned interview with Dawkins that it is morally justified to take one life to save the countless lives that could have been taken from Dr. Britt. He also believes it is morally justified to kill active abortion doctors, not retired ones, because otherwise it becomes vengeance and not defense. My next slide talks about the themes from class, with the first one being fundamentalism. Reverend Michael Bray embraces fundamentalism by strictly adhering to what he sees as the core truths of Christianity. He doesn't recognize a difference between the wrathful God of the Old Testament and the forgiving God of the New Testament. For him, God still judges sin, even under grace. At the same time, his traditionalism is reflected in how he seeks to carry out the original practices and moral standards of early Christianity. He's not just reading the scripture, he's trying to live it out through action, even if that includes violence. Moving on to sacred texts and language, Reverend Bray interprets the Bible literally, using it to justify real world actions. Scripture isn't symbolic to him, it's a guide for how people should live their lives. And this is shown through the literalism of Reverend Bray, where he emphasizes the word for word accuracy of the Bible, especially when defending violent actions. If violence is portrayed in the Bible, he believes it can still be relevant and justified today. Lastly, defensive action is one of the most crucial and central arguments of this case. Reverend Bray argues that violence is not always evil. Its morality depends on its intent. If the purpose is to protect innocent lives, it is seen as an act of love, not hatred, in the eyes of Reverend Bray. Now, referring to the similarities to other cases, the first one is the similarity to Eric Rudolph. Now, Eric Rudolph bombed Olympic Park, a gay bar, and similarly to Reverend Bray, abortion clinics. Next, Brooke Goldstein. I'm sorry if I butchered that. He was a Jewish settler who massacred over 30 Muslims in a mosque during their prayer. And like Bray, he believed that he was acting in God's name to protect Jews, using this to justify why his actions were moral. Lastly, the Ku Klux Klan. Both the KKK and Bray's ideology are rooted in religion to justify any actions done by their group. Moving on to the differences from these cases. First, Rudolph worked by himself individually. He avoided the public eye. This is contrary to Reverend Bray, who was a public religious defender. He was a theological spokesperson who was not afraid to be public about his actions or opinions. Brooke Goldstein committed mass murder in one event. Reverend Bray committed arson and bombings, not directly killing at all. The KKK focused on white supremacy and racial ideology. This is different than Reverend Bray, who focused on anti abortion Christian fundamentalism. These contrasts show how religious violence can have different motivations, even when tactics may appear similar. Moving on to the outlook for the future, there is a rising tension between religious liberty and public safety concerns that might continue to rise. There's also an ongoing risk of religiously motivated domestic terrorism that can sprout from Bray's actions and people's interpretations of his actions. We're seeing a rise in we're seeing a rise in Christian nationalist rhetoric, especially through ideas like the Dominion theology, which teaches Christians to take control of institutions and government. We may also see increased government intervention, such as change in free speech and religious freedom debates, increased surveillance of extremist groups, and a pushback from some conservative or religious groups. Overall, these tensions raise important questions about how to protect safety without suppressing freedom of belief. Now, lastly, the case shows how religious ideology can motivate both peace and violence. Reverend Michael Bray and the Army of God demonstrate how sacred texts can be weaponized and can be used to justify acts of terrorism. It's a reminder of the need to critically engage with religious teachings rather than accept them without context, especially when they're being used to support violence in God's name. With my references, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.